Hey listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. A few days ago, I was on my way to the store when I started to cry. A year ago, this would not have been remarkable. Back then, it was just 2 months after our dog Captain had died, and tears were available anytime I wanted, and even when I didn't want them. But in the past few months, the tears have literally evaporated. Even when I've wanted to cry, no dice. So to suddenly have salty water spilling down my face caught me by surprise, especially because I wasn't even thinking particularly cry-worthy thoughts. So what kickstarted this tear machine? Music. In particular, the song Not by Big Thief. There wasn't anything specific about the lyrics, it was more just the mix of it all. And to be honest, it was kind of a relief to have my tear ducts working again. I was grateful the music was able to speak to something inside of me that I wasn't able to access in other ways. And now, that song will forever be a marker of time, of the upwelling of grief on a sunny February day in 2026. This power of music to mark emotional time and to better understand ourselves is the backbone of Matt Fogelson's new memoir, Restrung. In it, he explores how music has been a companion for his major life events and transitions. One of those events was his father's death from cancer when Matt was a senior in college. Music became an important outlet for Matt to connect with the heartbreak, confusion, anger, and even self-loathing that were part of his grief. Later in life, music became a way for him to connect with his son and help to define the kind of father that he wanted to be. While music is a big part of this conversation, Matt and I also talk about the silence that surrounded his father's illness, the complicated legacy of a loved but in many ways absent parent, and how his Aunt Wendy turned out to be one of Matt's greatest teachers about both life and grief. Okay, here's our conversation. Matt, thanks for being part of Grief Out Loud today.
Thanks so much, Jana, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Music is really the backbone of your memoir, Restrung. And I have to thank you because as I was reading through your book and also reading through your Substack, every time you mentioned a song, I'd be like, oh my gosh, it would bring me right back to how old I was and where I was when I was listening to that song. So I felt like I was it was like a playlist that comes with your book, which I loved. But it did make me wonder, like, if you were going to create like a musical portrait of your father, which songs would you pick and why?
Sure. Well, my father wasn't much of a music guy. I didn't get it from him, although I didn't really get it from my mother either. So I'm not sure where it came from. But, for him, what comes to mind is classical music. So he was a corporate attorney in New York City in the 70s and 80s, very high pressure, a lot of stress in his job. And he did a lot of work at home, like on weekends. He was a workaholic, constantly working late at night and on weekends. And he would always have classical music on in his study. I think it was a way to try and create a sense of calm amidst the, chaos of his job. So in particular, I think Vivaldi, The Four Seasons comes to mind. I think that was one of his favorites. In terms of more popular music, on long car rides, he would put on Barry Manilow. Probably like most parents of a certain age. Really any song by Barry Manilow, but I think Mandy, I have vivid recollections of him belting out the chorus to that and did not have a great voice either. He had a lot of excellent qualities. His singing voice wasn't one of them. And so I think that was more of him kind of letting loose. And then a third song, I'm thinking about Cats in the Cradle, but that's really more for me than for him. That obviously that's the story of a father who's way too busy to hang out with his son when he's young, and then the son is too busy for the old man when he grows up. And I used to play that song a lot when I was 10, 11, 12. Usually when he was around, like hoping he would hear it and sort of like in that Pied Piper story, just magically follow me to Central Park to throw the football or something. That didn't really ever happen. But I don't know, I just really associate that song with him and growing up in that house for some reason, even though it's not really one of his songs.
But it's very integral to your experience of being his child.
Exactly.
One of my favorite parts in your book is when you talk about how your brother Rob, who gets car sick a lot, got really car sick when Barry Manilow was playing, and you sort of blamed the Barry Manilow for how sick he got.
Yeah. Perhaps a little unfair to Barry Manilow, who I have since grown to like.
So, your father was diagnosed with lung cancer when you were a sophomore in college, and then he died during your senior year of college. And I'm wondering, like so many years later, looking back at that time, what stands out to you now?
Really looking back, what I'm struck by most is how little we talked about the fact that he might die or was going to die. And actually, that's not even strong enough. Like we didn't talk at all about it. I remember him giving me and my brother the prognosis, which was 5 years on the high end. But his view of that was, and I don't know if this was an act, but I think he thought he was going to beat it. He would said to us, yeah, I'm young. He was 46 when he was diagnosed. He said, they caught it early. I don't have any symptoms. I'm going to be an outlier. That's what he said initially. And so that's kind of how he presented for the next 18 months, even as his condition was clearly deteriorating. He never sort of acknowledged what was going on. And I think he didn't want to bum me out. I was in college. I think he felt like he didn't want to, it's kind of a heavy thing, right? And he didn't want to impose on my life in that way or something. But looking back, it's very odd. And I adopted that same persona too. I remember once my mom saying to me, I think we need to prepare for the possibility that the worst happens. And I said to her, I actually think he's doing okay. And as I said in the book, I felt like my mom was falling. I couldn't put out my arms to catch her because I had kind of also adopted that facade. So that's kind of glaring to me looking back. I mean, God forbid I'm ever in that situation with my son, who's now 20. He's the age basically that I was when my dad died. I can't imagine not having some conversation with him and being like, look, I'm going to fight it. I hope I prevail, but you should know that it doesn't look good. And if the worst happens, know that I love you, that I think you're capable of doing anything you want to do. I don't want you to live your life mourning me. That's not going to help me, and it's not going to help you. And, some kind of conversation around it. It's very strange to me. And I guess one last point to drive that home. I remember going with him to a chemotherapy treatment when my mom couldn't do it. I was home for fall break or something. And we sat in this room, like this windowless room for like 8 hours. But we didn't really talk. Even then, even like faced with that reality, it was like he read his work papers, I read a book, nothing to see here. And I would say that coupled with feeling shocked when it actually happened, when he actually died. Looking back at the photographs of him in that period, it was obvious that he was dying, and I knew he was dying, yet part of me wouldn't admit it. And I was kind of shocked when he finally died, which is surprising to me now.
You mentioned, what you imagine you would say to your son if you were in a similar situation that your dad was, of having, been diagnosed with cancer. What do you think would have been different for you if your dad had been able to say those things to you, both in being there throughout his illness, but in the years after he died?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wonder about that. I think part of the grieving process that I went through, it was very difficult for me. And I think it was made more difficult, in fact, because we didn't have conversations like that. There wasn't this real sense of closeness and connection. I mean, I loved my dad, right? And I knew that he loved me. It wasn't like some terrible situation. But there was this lack of closeness. Like, as I say, I didn't really know who he was. as a person. And so I think when he died, my reaction to that, it was almost like I overcompensated for the lack of closeness while he was alive by trying to hold him really close after he died. And what I mean by that is following in his footsteps as a lawyer, and literally wearing his suits to work, even though it wasn't necessarily something that I really enjoyed and wanted to do. And yet for decades, I kept doing it. And I think that was in large part because I felt close to him. I thought, he could, maybe he see me doing this, and that brought me closer to him. And I think I also held the pain of it more than I might have otherwise in some weird way. I remember shortly after he died, I would go visit my mom at our apartment uptown. I was in law school downtown at NYU. And I would go into his closet. He had this very small closet where he kept all his suits and stuff. And I remember going in there and I could smell him still months after. And I would close myself in there and just breathe it in. Of course, eventually it faded and disappeared. And that was sort of the last physical vestige of him. And what I think I learned, this was not a healthy reaction, but by holding that pain, I could still feel him. I could still be with him. So I wonder if we had had a closer relationship, if we had conversations around this, if my need to have him so close wouldn't have been so strong afterwards. I wonder about that.
Or if there was a way to be close to him that didn't have to be rooted just in the pain of his absence, that you maybe would have had other anchor points of connection to him that weren't just in the loss piece.
Right, right.
Coming back to music again, what songs did you turn to in those early days and months after your father died?
A couple of bands in particular come to mind and songs. The first is Sweet Jane by the Velvet Underground. For me, that song, that's like been a lifelong, I've had a lifelong relationship with Sweet Jane, and my relationship to it has sort of changed over time as I've grown up and stuff. But there was a period when I was in high school where that song was like a song of just unbridled joy for me. And my friends would come over before we would go out to a party or whatever. Our apartment was sort of, thanks to my parents' kind of progressive beer drinking policy. I think my older brother had just worn them down. My friends would come over to my apartment and we would hang out before we would go out. And I would always put on Sweet Jane. And we would just dance around like a pre-grunge mosh pit, kind of just throwing ourselves into each other. And it was like this song of joy to me. Interestingly, after my father died, it was the song I immediately turned to. I remember after the funeral, grabbing my guitar and just playing those four chords over and over and over again. I think I did that because I wanted to sort of get back in touch with that kid dancing around his room. That song was like a portal or something back to a me kind of untouched by death and grief and confusion. And, so that song was one that I kind of returned to try and find that kid again and in some way. The other band, well, really it was two, Soundgarden and Pearl Jam. But really, Soundgarden and their Super Unknown record came out when I was in law school, which was just a year after my dad died. That music is very dark. It is filled with rage and self-loathing. And those were things that I had in spades at that time. But I didn't have a way to express that anger, to kind of off-gas that toxicity. And this music, Soundgarden and Chris Cornell, the lead singer, his screaming, he like screamed for me. That music also just created a space where I could just be my true self, where I didn't have to say I'm okay when people asked how I was. I could just feel what I was feeling. And I would literally put my headphones on and just blast that album. and afterwards feel restored in some way, like I could function. I could go like hang out with people. It just it was interesting. It just created this internal retreat space that I needed at that time, and also just was just a way to it was songs about emotions that I was feeling very deeply, particularly self-loathing, and I kind of felt when I listened to that music like somebody understood me, somebody had my back, even if their intentions were pure malevolence. It was like it was comforting to me somehow. So, and Pearl Jam too, to a certain extent. I mean, to a large extent, also just that grunge music. It just really struck a chord. And I often feel like I was born a decade too late because all my favorite bands were, from the '70s, and so I missed all these bands or saw them later. Like the Grateful Dead after Jerry's voice was shot, Allman Brothers without Duane Allman. But my timing was perfect for grunge.
You mentioned the self-loathing a few times, and I'm curious, what is the connection there with the grief?
Yeah. That's a good question. That was sort of my reaction to his dying, was this internal anger. And I think that maybe it just, I had a lot of anger at the world, or I think subconsciously at him for dying on me. And I didn't, like I said, I didn't know what to do with it. And then at some point, I kind of figured out I could direct it at myself because, like I said, listening to Soundgarden helped. But, as I say in the book, I figured out that I was like a Waffle House. I was there 24/7, 365. And so I just turned that anger inward. I just had a huge crisis of self-confidence after my dad died. I just felt very alone in my grief. I felt like even my mom and my brother, we all were going to grieve differently. And we tried to be there for each other, but I felt very, very alone. So I think that led to sort of a crisis of confidence in some ways. I think also it probably was not the best time to be going to law school, like literally months after he died, because that's like a very supercharged, or a lot of very smart people. In retrospect, probably should have taken some time off instead of throwing myself into that cauldron. But yeah, there was definitely a downward spiral happening.
Well, it seems like, at least from your book, I know your dad was pretty absent in the day to day because he was working constantly. Even when he was home, he was working. On vacation, he was working. Weekends, working. And it seems even in that absence, though, he loomed very large as like a presence and a personality in your family dynamic and in your life. And then when he died, in that vacuum that got left behind, it seems like that's what came in, was like go to law school, or a lot of anger. Like there just seemed like there was a vacuum there that needed to get filled in some way.
Yeah, I think like probably a lot of sons, your father is someone you put on a pedestal. And I think he benefited too, and my mom unfairly was on the other side of that equation. He benefited from his absence. Your frustrations you take out on the one who's present. My mom was always there, and she was always yelling at my dad to get him to come home for dinner, to when he would cancel vacations on the way to the airport, which happened. And at the time, I always sided with my father because the screaming scared me. I wanted it to stop. She was the one screaming. That's how I would ask her to please stop yelling at him. It's not like he wants to work all the time. And I think that was very unfair to her because in retrospect, I feel like she was screaming on my behalf. I didn't even know how upset I was really. And she was just trying to get him to be with us. And that's not something I think I appreciated at the time. And my dad, he just could do no wrong. And the fact that he was never around, well, that just proved how important he was and how impressive he was. And even though he wasn't around, it still had a huge effect on me when he died.
It's interesting that you talked about wanting your mom's, like the yelling, right? That was scary, and to get her to stop, to like side with your dad, because that would end the yelling. But then in the like the height of the grief, what you turned to was Chris Cornell's yelling through Soundgarden. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, I mean, I wasn't a screamer, that I didn't like screaming, but in the home.
What do you think eventually started to shift your grief or your experience of grief through that avenue of self loathing, if anything?
I think I struggled with that for a while, and at some point, I came to understand something that my Aunt Wendy, who's a pivotal figure in the book in my life, my mom's younger sister, and sort of an odd bird in our family. My family was a bunch of professional types. All of my parents' friends were, New York City professionals. Aunt Wendy was kind of a flower child type, wore these loud sundresses and so many bracelets you could hear coming a mile away. And she lived about an hour north of the city, and only saw her like twice a year. But she wrote me this note after my dad died about totally predicting what was going to happen. She's like, you're going to have moments when the pain is overwhelming, and you're going to bring it inside. And what I want for you in those moments is to see you the way I see you from the outside, which is this very humble person, or this beautiful person, whatever. Don't be overwhelmed by the pain. You need to allow those feelings to be expressed, but don't be self-consumed by them. Like, she seemed to know that this darkness was going to descend on me. And so she was counseling me to, be aware of that, which of course at the time I thought was like psycho mumbo jumbo. Like, I was like, I kind of adopted my parents' stance towards Aunt Wendy, which was basically to just roll my eyes at her. And whenever she quoted Bob Dylan, which she did all the time, just, because she wasn't a serious person, like that's how I viewed her growing up, even though I always felt this connection to her on the music front. Someone who wore her passions for music on her sleeve. There's something that connected with me about that, but it was like this push and pull with her and my dad, the two worlds sort of colliding. But I think with time, I came to understand what she was talking about, and to realize that this self-loathing, it wasn't real, I remember beating myself up in law school when my first law school grade was an A minus, and I was ecstatic for about 5 seconds. And then I just started, you're an idiot. You're never going to see another A minus. You got lucky, all this. I came to understand, I think, that if this sort of self-loathing were a person, it would be like a conspiracy theorist, someone, just incapable of changing their position based on observable fact. So I think over time, I came to understand that. I think part of it too, I talk about in the book, I think the music had something to do with that. In particular, I remember this very cathartic moment listening to Pearl Jam and Release, and where Eddie Vedder at the end, he's just screaming, release me, loud. And I would play that song, at 11, and scream along. And eventually it occurred to me that for years I had been screaming that, not at myself necessarily, but like I kind of viewed it as my dad saying, release me from the role I'm playing in your psyche. It's okay. You're good. I'm okay. You don't have to hold this space for me. It was like this breakthrough moment where I was like, okay, I sort of have permission to move on.
Speaking of Aunt Wendy, and then your really close friend Murphy, and throughout the course of the book, you write about your connection with them and then also that both of them have died. And wondering what you've learned about yourself in grieving for three different people who were really important to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think I grieved for them all very differently. We've discussed my dad, and not that wasn't the healthiest response. With Murphy, it was such a shock to me when he died. So we were best friends in middle school and freshman year of high school. We did everything together, mostly record shopping in the village. But we kind of grew apart in high school. I mean, we did grow apart, no big blow up or anything. We just sort of went separate paths, and I didn't really talk to him much the rest of high school and at all after high school. And then one day, a friend calls to tell me that he died of cancer. 40, I think he was 42 years old. And so, of course, I knew from my dad was 48 when he died. And so, of course, I knew that people die of cancer in their 40s and even younger. But he was a peer. It was such a shock. My immediate reaction to that was that night, I remember I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs, got out the headphones, and I started playing these cassettes that he'd made for me that I still had. Back in the day, you recorded albums on cassettes. That's how you shared music. If any young people are listening. um, and I still had, in fact, REM's Life Rich Pageant was on. I think it was one of the albums that he recorded. He was big into REM. And I, listened to those tapes at like 2 a.m. And then for like a week, I was on his Facebook page, which was still up, and gleaned from that music that he was into before he died. And I remember listening to that. It was as if I was trying to find him again or be with him, and I thought I could find him in the music or something. That's kind of how I processed that, was just by just trying to find him again or something. And Aunt Wendy, I didn't appreciate the influence that she had on me till years and years after she was like a presence in my life. And so, when she died of cancer, she was, I think, probably early 60s or something. I was sad, of course, but it wasn't until years later, and really in writing this book, that I came to understand what a profound influence she had on me in kind of setting an example for me of someone who lived their passion and wasn't afraid to live their passion. And I really think that she was instrumental in me making some changes in my life that were very beneficial. And so my grief for her, it's sort of like, I didn't even know that about her and us. And so what do you do with that? It's like that I just feel guilt about, like never really expressing to her. I never really met her where she was trying to make connection with me, and I never really met her there. And I really feel horrible about that.
Yeah, as you're talking now, it seems like in the reflection on when your Aunt Wendy was alive, of seeing that relationship was pretty one-sided, as it can often be with extended family members. And you're a kid and like they're pouring into you and you're not really pouring back to them or even seeing the impact that they're having. I'm just wondering now, in writing the book and connecting more with her and the influence she had in your life, sometimes people will say like, oh, I have a different relationship with that person now that they have died than I did when they were here. And I wonder if you feel more of a back and forth with her now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think she was instrumental in my decision to start a music blog, which I did in 2014. I would feel her presence every time I sat down at the keyboard, telling me it's okay, like giving me permission to do this activity, which from my mindset, which I recognize as, strange to probably to people, that music wasn't really something you did or took seriously growing up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It was a hobby at best. And so I had totally internalized that belief. I was going to be a member of the professional class. That's just, I never thought about it. Deciding to kind of quit my job as a lawyer and also the decision to start this music blog, those were kind of watershed moments for me. She was completely instrumental in getting me to that. And so I definitely feel her a lot more now than I did at the time.
I'm picturing her giving you like a jingle jangle bracelet high five for making some of these decisions to become quote unquote unserious.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Right.
You mentioned your son, who's now in his 20s. And what role did grief play in the decisions you've made about how you parent him?
I think first and foremost, a concerted effort to be present more than my dad was, which, admittedly was a low bar. But I remember just making this commitment to be there for as much as he'd wanted for as long as I was around, whatever that meant. And if that meant, work got put on the back burner, that wasn't even a decision to be made. And I think I had made a lot of effort to just be with him. Not necessarily even talking necessarily. I mean, so for some reason he became a big golfer when he was a kid. I never played golf as a kid, but my father-in-law is a big golfer and my mom plays a little bit. So he kind of got into it from visiting them and he became a really good golfer. And I never played. I played a few times in college, but that was more just like an excuse to hang out with my friends. um, but when he got into it, I kind of started taking lessons and with an idea towards this is an opportunity to just be with him, even though I was terrible. He was very encouraging, and so that's not something my father would have ever done. I mean, first of all, it's a huge time commitment, to play golf. So I think that's a big part of it. I think literally telling him every day that I love him. My dad, when he was diagnosed, wrote my brother and me this letter, which he kept under wraps until his funeral when his law partner gave it to us, which was kind of this bizarre moment. But one of the things he said was that I love you and I regret not telling you that more. And then in relation to my mom, he's like, he was admonishing us to treat her with unconditional love and that you need to tell your Phyllis, my mom is Phyllis, when you meet your Phyllis, you need to tell her every day that you love her. Don't think that it's not macho or something. Life's so short and unpredictable. And so, I really taken that to heart with my son, who, well, he no longer lives with us, right? But when he did, every night, I love you. Seems like a small thing, and it is, but it had a lot of meaning for me. And the other thing that I did with him was I would just sing a song to him at night, every night, for 14 years. As it turned out, I sang this song to him that's how I begin the book, with bringing him home from the hospital when he wouldn't stop screaming. We didn't know what to do. Like feeding him didn't help, and I just started singing, which was odd because I don't really sing. And I sang him this Grateful Dead song, which was also odd. I didn't sing, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or something. I sang Broke Down Palace, and it worked. It happens to be a great lullaby. And so I kept singing to him, and I figured, whatever, I'll sing to him, for the next couple months or whatever. I ended up singing to him every night until he started staying up later than me when he was like 14. Not just Broke Down Palace, other songs I added. But, that created this really nice space at the end of the day where, we would talk a little bit about his day. And then I would literally get into bed with him. We'd sing. And I just have such fond memories of him. Like, he'd be brushing his teeth and then he'd be like, Papa, I'm ready for my song. you know? So I think just like being with him more is the main thing.
And what comes through in your book too is this desire for him to have the chance to know you in a way that you didn't get to know your father, and that music being such a big part of who you are in your life, and you know, really meaningful pivotal moments of your life being intertwined with music, that it makes total sense to me that you would be sharing yourself through music with him.
Yeah. Yeah. To the point where for his bar mitzvah, I got him a turntable and some vinyl. There were a few bands that he liked. Like he was a big Springsteen fan and U2, not the Rolling Stones. I had this idea that even before I had a child, that I would get my son or daughter all the classic Rolling Stones albums when they turned 13. But he wasn't that into them, so I didn't do that. But I got him this turntable and vinyl and speakers, and you know, it was a bit of a dud, because he wasn't as into music as I was at that age. And I kind of knew it would be, but I really just wanted to give him a piece of me, so that he would maybe one day look back on it and, just have a piece of me. That was important to me. It was important to me that he know who my friends were. I still have lifelong friends who he knows their kids. That was important to me. I never knew who my dad's friends were. I have no idea. I don't know what he was like. My son recently asked me, we were out to dinner for our anniversary. He asked my wife, what was Papa like in college? And then he gave his take on what he thought I was like, which was not flat, I sat in the corner and my wife was, oh, he was very a lot of fun to be with in college. But, I never it never occurred to me to ask my dad that. And I was stunned that my son asked me that. And I don't, for some reason, that was important to me.
One more music question for you.
Uh-huh.
Which we started with three songs, that are connected to your dad in some way. What three songs do you wish you could share with your dad?
The one that comes immediately to mind is, I've already mentioned, is Release by Pearl Jam. And I think that song, which is sort of like almost like a prayer that Eddie Vedder, the lead singer, is singing to his deceased biological father. I mean, the lyrics of that so resonated with me, dear dad, can you see me now? I am myself like you somehow. I wait up in the dark for you to speak to me. I'll hold the pain, release me. That when I was in law school, literally imagining my dad seeing me as him, being in law school. And I would wait up in the dark for him to speak to me. I'd check that box. And so I guess I'd want him to hear that song, just sort of ask him if he ever heard me talking to him. And then a song called Without Letting Go by Laurie Sargent comes to mind, which was from the Party of Five soundtrack, if you remember that show from the 90s. And so that song is about a woman who's in a relationship with a guy who just broke up with his old girlfriend. And so the woman is saying, she's having doubts about the relationship because she's saying, he said goodbye without letting go. I ain't going to settle for half a man who just keeps on looking back. And I've often thought, am I half a man to my wife? Was I at some point? Because I kept looking back. And because I said goodbye without letting go to my dad. And I guess I would want him to know that I, in many ways, have not let go, that I still think of him all the time. I miss him, I need him, and I love him. So I want him to know that. And then the last song would be Broke Down Palace. It's funny, like a colleague of mine died several years ago, and I went to his funeral, and his son gave a eulogy, and his son was probably in his 30s, early 30s. And it's incredible. He talked about how he and his dad used to sing that song together, and how the last night in hospice, he got into bed with his dad and sang that song for the last time. And I remember driving home after that and thinking, I've sung Broke Down Palace to my son probably more times than Jerry Garcia ever did, ever sang that song. But, I think I was singing it to my dad also, like my colleague's son. And I was thinking about the line, fare thee well, I love you more than words can tell. And so I want him to hear that song, to know that I love him more than words can tell.
I'm struck over and over again in reading your memoir, Restrung, and in speaking with you today, Matt, how music can get to the heart of things and provide words that maybe are hard for us to up with on our own. 20 different people can hear the same song and it's going to maybe hit a little different part of their heart, but there's a universal connection there. So
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, really appreciating the way you wove that music as an expression of grief through your life and also through your memoir, Restrung. I'm also having a little bit of a laugh on the inside of picturing your very serious lawyer dad listening to the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty funny.
Well, Restrung went out into the public on February 3rd of this year, and I'm wondering, how you're feeling about your story being so public.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about it and terrified, and I think in equal measure, depending which day you catch me on, I'm one or more of those things. I remember when I started the blog, my wife was like, "Why would you put such personal stuff out there?" And I remember thinking, well, I've only got 20 subscribers, so who cares? And maybe not that many people are going to read the book, so maybe that's comforting somehow. But I'm kind of hearing that voice again a little bit. But I'm very proud of the book, and hopefully it'll resonate with other folks who've lost a parent early, or fathers and sons who aren't really able to break through to each other, or anyone who's kind of felt like they've lived a life of self-constraint in some way, and of course music lovers. So hopefully it'll resonate with others.
Well, and one thing I really appreciate about it is for folks maybe who someone hasn't died, but they're looking around thinking, I would like to maybe deepen my connection with somebody before they die, that music could be a way to do that. I appreciate, I'm thinking specifically around like teens or young adults who maybe are trying to figure out, like, how do I really connect with people? And that music can be something that can help even cross-generationally. So yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you for taking time to talk with me today for Grief Out Loud, for sharing with our listeners, and for putting your book out into the world. I'm really excited for other people to get to connect with your words. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I really enjoyed this.
And listeners, I will link to Restrung, Matt's memoir, as well as his Substack and the music blog that he mentioned. And I just want to thank you all for being part of our community, for tuning in, for sharing episodes with people you think who might be supported in some way by the conversations that we're having here. If you would ever want to talk to me directly, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's dougy.org. That's our main website. And there you'll find information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources like tip sheets and activity sheets, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Always excited to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.